Colleagues, thank you so much for this invitation. And what I want to talk to you very much now about is about the role of extended practitioners and communities of practice in shaping education policy. And part of that, what I'm sharing with you, is based on a publication I did a year ago or so that focused on addressed really initial teacher trainers as at the end of the training to kind of explore what's next. How do you develop your post PG, your post PGC learning further as you've engaged with academic literature, as you have written assignments, etc. How do you actually explore that further as part of developing an extended practitioner? And I'm taking the angle very much from a kind of, I'm setting it in within the context of our really volatile, uncertain settings at the moment, a world that is has got its challenges, a world that really is driven by new technology and therefore change is at foot and ever pace is fast as ever. And I think for me, and that's where the picture comes in, not because it's hot today and we possibly all would like to jump into a cold pool. It's more about these two boys here representing the children and the next generation. And that's ultimately what gets me out of bed and makes to try to make a difference by shaping education policy. But you can't do it alone, and that interlinks very much with your kind of conference title around collaborating. So allow me to briefly set the wider context, entitled of Education and Lifelong Learning in an Ever-Changing World. Our ecosystem of education is complex insofar that and it can't be drawn nicely in the sense of where local community sits, where the government regions are. They're constantly flux. The new government regions drawn up as we speak. There are new combined authorities emerging. There is England, there's the UK, there's the world, and all that is influenced, and we are sitting within that as education system. And you're familiar with those different layers of the education system, but that global trends, the VUCA world is as well as the geopolitical influences are constantly influencing our thinking and then influencing the day-to-day running of education systems in the country, but also at local level. We all know of the financial pressures and the policy that are driving our education system, and therefore are challenging us from top down to local level. And acclimatization in this country was one approach to basically give more freedom, but even there are some challenges in terms of what does the new national curriculum demands mean for academies who may have developed their own curriculum approach and possibly succeeded. More than ever, and I think it's in the forefront of this government thinking, is definitely the kind of socio-economic influence on the education sector. And as you may know from the biography, my background is very much in languages and language education. And I've just come off a webinar where we explored the most recent Languages Trends report that really for the first time also unpicked the data of the situation of language learning in England by articulating clearly whether there's a difference, whether you are going to a school in an affluent or in a social more deprived area. And the difference is stark in terms of language choice, in terms of language resources, but also in terms of offer with regards to international experience, school trips, etc., etc. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is in a first world nation, is that acceptable, that inequality of offer? And then obviously linked to that is that family support. And those issues seem to have cropped up for the last decade, 20 years or so, but have definitely been reinforced since the pandemic more and more. And because of the global pandemic, because of the focus on a growth agenda, there's also that employability agenda and skills driving the education system, even not just at school level, not just at GCSE level, but even universities in terms of employability data, focusing very much of what does the system deliver in terms of the future workforce. And here's an example of a combined authority skills priority that is, I think, summarizing nicely where we're heading as a country. Is about bigger, better skilled, more diverse workforce. It's creating career pathways, and I'm very much in favor of that kind of element of really thinking through, if you're starting a level 2 qualification, so GCSE, apprenticeships, etc., where could it lead us? Where are our stepping stones? How can we make a success? But everything seems to be focusing in the debate on those skills elements. But in that skills debate, and that interlinks so nicely with the title of the conference, the forefront of the focus is collaboration and innovation, and collaboration between players in the ecosystem and players outside of the ecosystem, namely employers, policymakers, investors, etc., etc. I apologize if you hear a noise behind me, but I'm near a hospital, so the air ambulance is landed. But what's really important is not just listening to employers, but also listening to our students. And as part of our university's outreach program, we obviously have got sixth form students regularly coming to us. And over the last few months, we have explored that kind of skills agenda with them in a bit more detail. And what was really interesting is the response to this question: which factor is the most important to you? And that's a data set of about 200 respondents of two different sets. And it's really interesting from our perspective that those bigger agendas that we are thinking about as institutions around globalization, increasing individualization, climate change, digitalization, is not necessarily on the forefront of a sixth former, but it's that future of work piece. So that thinking about what will the future for me look like is quite an important one that we need to consider as part of our education offer. And here, a slightly different picture. Here at Newcastle, it's the same at many universities, and as a country also at school level through the school's curriculum and assessment review that is currently going in England. It's ultimately, what does the future of curriculum need to look like? And it's the student's perspective gives us a very interesting direction of travel. It's very much employability focused. It's very much focused on active engagement, on experiential learning, on interdisciplinary elements, but also that flexibility element. And when you delve a bit deeper around the flexibility, it's also interlinked by the economic challenge that more and more students are forced to, in particular undergraduates, are forced to actually take on more part-time jobs in order to financially sustain their university degree experience. And that's a really kind of important aspect for us to consider in the wider picture. And therefore, a narrative has emerged, and that's really important around the lifelong learning agenda. Everyone seems to be, from a political perspective, convinced that we need to kind of create the lifelong learners. It will be the educational development, but particularly technological development, will require us constantly to develop. And whilst in the teaching profession, we know that in order to go up the ladder, you have to kind of learn and develop and engage. We do know that actually the adult learner engagement internationally is shrinking quite considerably. And we're looking at about the OECD data looks at about 11% of active engagement in Australia with PGT programs. In this country, we're looking at 3%. So, is it that challenge that Anthony Selden in his book has given us of actually, do we need to rethink the factory model and actually explore a quite different approach to education? And today's announcement by the Secretary of State around the lifelong learning entitlement and a much more modular approach is a sign of or an indication of how policy is responding to such challenges. I think for us all, it's really important to hold ourselves and our organizations to account in terms of that inclusivity and equitable quality of education that we are ultimately aiming for, partly because of the United Nations, but also as a country through the social justice agenda moving forward. And the Institute for Lifelong Learning at UNESCO is highlighting very much here in their definition. By working together, we can ensure that lifelong learning makes a full contribution across a range of interrelated agendas, including social justice, sustainable development, and global citizenship. And it's that lifelong learning element that ultimately interlinks us to those kind of elements of the communities of practice and the extended practitioners. As initial teacher trainers, we have been developing over many years in this country, and Newcastle is a good example, as we were apparently in the history the first institution that actually created a chair in teacher education back in the end of the 19th century. We've got a long tradition of university-based initial teacher education. We've also got a long history of a commitment to part-time and professional qualifications, both at master's and doctorate level, and Wolverhampton is one example of such institutions. So the question for us is it about revolution or is it evolution that we need to be engaging with? For me, it's that the system will develop, the policies will develop, but also a key player around in this whole ecosystems are we as educators. And we as educators, not necessarily with formal leadership roles, but educators as change agents. And I think that is where the starting point for me kicks in around that work around restrictive versus extended professional. And personally, I think the word restricted professional is an ill-informed concept in the sense of when you look at the characteristics, it's what I would say good classroom teaching requires, and possibly are the criteria that we're looking for in terms of our initial teacher training approaches moving forward. But where we need to get colleagues to, and that's the argument around the kind of those who supported extended professional argument, is around actually contextualizing all activities in the wider context. And it's about reflecting critically and systematically on one's own practice, but that reflection then leads to what we would possibly have called in the past action research, practitioner inquiries, etc., to actually develop oneself and one's teams through those initiative action research projects. What is really important here, as it's outlined, is around those characteristics, is that kind of difference between engaging in a short-term fashion versus actually engaging systematically planned in order to actually not only develop practice, but also influence one's own and develop one's own teacher persona. And what's really important there is, and I think that's where the main difference is ultimately around this kind of evidence and research-based movement in terms of that underpins that decision-making of an extended professional. And I give you two examples because sometimes in the language debate, what's really interesting is in this country is that who is creating that enthusiasm for language learning in a school? Is it a teacher? Is it the environment? Is it really important that the head teacher is from the start on board? Or are the possibilities where actually local change agents can drive the direction? And I think for us to kind of think about that, extended practitioners who've identified a problem, who are working, created possibly a coalition, not necessarily yet with the senior leader, but with colleagues, with like-minded colleagues, either within the school or outside of the school, can drive change. Change, as the first one showed, through purely an initiative with an external partner, here BMW, and basically develop a one-day project that becomes a sustained initiative. And interestingly, when you look in this case study more of it in more detail, what ends up is that the school leadership team becomes suddenly much more interested around languages because there is that local link to employability there, and therefore also an interest in terms of, oh, do we need to support German in this particular school more? And interestingly, that particular school ended up having an agreement with that manufacturer that students who enter the GCSE German would automatically get an interview for an apprenticeship if they wish to. They weren't guaranteed an apprenticeship, but an interview for an apprenticeship. Another example, and that challenges our kind of social justice debate that I started off with, is giving access to international experiences through a change agent who ultimately has worked in a more positive context, insofar that that school is already committed to the international outset, but utilized their extended networks, but also their skill set of an extended professional to write a bid into the Turing Fund in order to access quite considerable amount of funding for their school to support their students to actively engage with international experiences. And that leads me from the kind of local individual possible change agent to what I would say a really powerful movement of communities of practice where extended professionals can hopefully flourish. And I'm sure that for most of you, the concept of communities of practice is familiar, but just very briefly, uh, uh, overview of how Wenger has ultimately identified it. It's about advancing the knowledge and skills focused on a domain. So ultimately, it's about identifying a particular aspect that people are coming together. Is it AI in education nowadays? Is it, in one of my examples, the languages, the challenges around languages? Is it a particular pedagogical challenge in terms of actually, whether it's around assessment for learning, whether it's around literacy, etc., etc. So we're coming together around a domain. And it's about developing an active community of members. So, and it's about the commitment of the members to actually engage in such communities of practice. It's not the kind of dipping in, dipping out approach. It's ultimately, I am a kind of proactive member, shaping the debate, contributing to the debate through my reading, through my experience, through my reflections. I'm bringing through my questions. I'm actively engaging. And the ultimate aim is that everyone in that community of practice wants to enhance their practice. Their practice in the classroom, the practice as school leaders, the practice, whatever domain they are discussing. And here are just some examples that you and colleagues that you're aware of will have engaged with from early career training experts in school learning communities, subject, etc., etc., etc. But the important element for us is how do we as an institution, organization, facilitate that and enable this so that all our colleagues are enabled and developed to actually become these extended professionals, have the opportunity to become those extended professionals. I assume, whilst there isn't reference to the extended professional literature at all in the early career framework, one could be exploring, but to what extent an early career framework is aligned to those communities of practice. But at a kind of first step level, it's about ultimately those elements around problem solving, about really exploring problems or initiatives that then allow you to grow. And this is, I would say, an example of kind of your first step approach, which is one of the activities we have asked some of the ECTs to explore as part of their journey to an extended practitioner. But allow me to jump to established communities of practice. So on the one hand, it might be focusing on where colleagues in a university come together and talk about efficiencies at the moment, yeah? And that's a good example of the first picture, where colleagues from different across the university are trying to solve one wicked problem. And the problem is, how do we ensure that we are as efficient as possible in our processes? Yeah. And the colleagues here actually did not just have those approach of kind of meeting every 2 or 3 a month. They actually decided in the end we need a kind of couple of days to really thrash it out and explore it jointly with an external facilitator, for example. Communities of practice at institutional level on a particular new initiative, such as education strategies, is another example where like-minded people in terms of what we want to achieve are coming together, but in the world of academia, more so than possibly in some of the school settings, where also people bring their academic and extended knowledge into, and the discipline knowledge into the debate of curriculum change. The last picture is just referring to communities of practice goes often beyond just that professional dialogue around the table. It often goes beyond in terms of also interlinking at conferences and enjoying time together, as you can see here, some linguists at the end of a language conference letting their hair down dancing. And I want to move on from this point to how communities of practice are not just for developing oneself, but also influencing policy. And I want to give an example around the language GCSE reform. And the communities of practice that it was established here was initially bringing together different communities of practice from different stakeholder groups into one community of practice. And the reason for that was that the Department for Education at the time decided to establish a subject content expert panel group without consulting the various subject associations. And that, you won't be surprised, didn't go down well at all. And therefore, through a concerted effort of the communities of practice, the various communities of practice came together and they actually decided, okay, we need to speak with one voice here in order for us to be heard. We can't go to these tables of discussions and constantly say, oh, we would like this in the CCC, we would like this. Is ultimately, let's come together and agree on the 5 or 6 aspects that we all will communicate at all stages. And this has led, and it wasn't easy, but this has led that communities of practice have actually managed to renegotiate the GCC content to a more acceptable model within the language community. Very clear here, it was not a community of practice success in terms of creating their own GCSE. No, it was very much kind of negotiation and compromising on those. Interestingly, at that time, the discourse between the communities of practice joint voice and the policymakers at one point collapsed. And that was a big challenge for us because actually that could have meant that policymakers could just make decisions without involving stakeholders forward. But what is really important in this process is who are those communities of practice of stakeholders? They are actually those extended individuals who have continued through their own classroom practice, through research, through gathering evidence. They have developed a much broader understanding to influence policy. And particularly in this country, where policy and education policy is so much more openly driven by consultation than in many other countries, is actually a great opportunity for individual extended professionals, but also the broader communities of practice to influence policy making. So allow me some final reflections. In order to position educators as a change agent, we need to create a system and a pathway for our educators to allow them to fully develop professional identity from a PGCE course onwards through the early careers program, through their career. But we need to also enable them to be lifelong learning, extended professionals that are then enabled within the school context or their other education context as change agents. And change agents that may sometimes challenge the status quo, but are also very much with the focus of positive change for learners and their subject discipline. And if we get that right, then we actually create automatically active contributors to communities of practice. So it's about the individual and how do we get the individual much more proactively involved into those communities of practice. The second reflection is around policy. And I think the most recent curriculum assessment review here in England has shown us that the panel really tried to focus in on evidence-based. And it was interesting, the word evidence-based really caused problems initially in the consultation period, because by week 2, they didn't have many submissions and were worried that actually the word evidence stops school leaders and schools to submit, but universities to create quite a lot of research-focused input. So we need to get to a culture where we actually create a kind of evidence base within the school setting in order to influence policy. But it's also about forming these coalitions. And when I talk about forming coalitions, it's very much that kind of, we can't achieve things on our own. It's about working in collaboration. And it might not always be within your discipline. It might also be getting people from outside of the discipline engaging, employers engaging, etc., to forming. But what's really important is ultimately for policymakers at the moment is speaking with one voice. And if we get this right, then hopefully, and that's the ultimate aim, it will enable all our learners, and I do mean here all learners, to reach their potential wherever they are on this climbing wall.